From the beaches of Hawaii to the brightest lights of the UFC, few fighters have ever carried the weight of expectation the way Max Holloway did. For more than a decade, he wasn't just a contender or a champion, he was the heartbeat of an entire division, a fighter whose rhythm, precision, and relentless pace carved out what fans now call the Blessed Era. His performances became moments etched into UFC history. The dismantling of Jose Aldo, the surgical showcase against Calvin Kattar, where he landed over 400 significant strikes, and the shocking knockout at UFC 300 that reminded the world why Holloway was still one of the most dangerous men alive. But behind every highlight clip was a shadow the cameras never captured. The weight cuts that nearly broke him, the health scares that sparked global concern, the crushing trilogy with Alexander Volkanovski, and the pressure of carrying the hopes of an entire state on his shoulders. It raises a question far heavier than any punch Max has ever absorbed. How does a fighter built from pure heart survive in a sport that demands everything from him every time? To understand why the UFC still needs him more than he needs them, why fans refuse to let his story fade, and why every rise came with a hidden cost, we have to return to where this legend was forged, long before the belts, the fame, and the chaos. Long before Max Holloway ruled the featherweight division, he was just a kid growing up in Waianae, Hawaii, a place known for its beauty, but also its unforgiving reality. Raised in a community where hardship was part of daily life, Max learned early that nothing would ever be handed to him. His family struggled, opportunities were scarce, and the world seemed far away from the bright lights of the UFC. But inside the chaos of his environment, something else was forming an unshakable resilience that would eventually define his entire career. When most fighters discover their passion in organized gyms, Max found his through survival. By his teenage years, he was training in small local gyms, sharpening his striking through countless hours of repetition, developing a fluid style that felt less like technique and more like instinct. Coaches immediately noticed how unnaturally calm he remained under pressure, how he read opponents with a maturity far beyond his age. It didn't take long before Hawaii whispered what the world would soon shout. This kid was different. At just 20 years old, he became one of the youngest fighters ever signed by the UFC. A moment that signaled not just a dream fulfilled, but the beginning of a new era. Every fight built momentum. His sharp boxing dismantled veterans. His cardio drowned opponents. His confidence radiated through every stare down, every exchange, every step into the cage. And when he began stringing together wins, fans and analysts alike started asking if the UFC had just discovered its next dominant champion. Key moments followed. Decisive victories against rising contenders, the near-flawless run that positioned him as a title challenger, and the signature swagger that made him unforgettable. By the time he captured gold, Max Holloway wasn't just a fighter anymore. He was the symbol of a generation, the embodiment of Hawaii's fighting spirit, the man destined to redefine what it meant to rule a division. Yet, as his star rose higher and higher, another force grew quietly in its shadow, waiting to collide with everything he had built. And when it finally did, it would test far more than just his skill. It would test the very foundation of who Max Holloway believed he was. For a fighter as composed and technically gifted as Max Holloway, controversy was never supposed to be part of the story. Yet the moments that tested him the most weren't knockdowns in the octagon, they were the battles no one prepared him for. The first major shock came in 2018, during what was supposed to be one of the biggest opportunities of his career, stepping in on short notice to fight Khabib Nurmagomedov at UFC 223. What should have been the defining moment of his rise instead became a global concern. Reporters noticed that Max looked unusually drained, his speech slowed, his focus drifting. Hours later, doctors pulled him from the fight, citing issues related to an extreme weight cut. It was the kind of incident that sent fans into a spiral of questions. Was Holloway's body beginning to fail him, or was something even more complicated happening behind the scenes? That year marked the beginning of a new conversation around him, one centered on health scares, neurological worries, and the brutal reality of cutting to 145 pounds after years of war inside the cage. Then came the trilogy with Alexander Volkanovski. The first loss shocked the world. The second ignited debate. and the third forced fans to ask whether Max was starting to lose the edge that once made him untouchable. Some blamed poor judging, others blamed circumstances, but the storyline was clear. Holloway, once seen as unstoppable, was now fighting opponents and a narrative he couldn't control. The questions grew louder when clips emerged of him slurring his words during interviews, leading to waves of speculation about potential long-term damage. Holloway denied anything was wrong, insisting he was fine, but the doubt lingered. It was a rare moment where fans weren't celebrating him, they were worried for him. And then, despite all criticism, he delivered one of the greatest striking performances in UFC history against Calvin Kattar, proving he was still operating on a level almost no one else could reach. But even that triumph had a darker undertone. Many wondered, was Holloway pushing himself beyond safe limits just to remind the world he wasn't done? Every scandal, every health scare, every disappointing result revealed something deeper. His relationship with the UFC was far more complicated than the public realized. To the organization, Max wasn't just another fighter. He was a star whose presence stabilized an entire division. But that also meant every setback had ripple effects the public never saw. A canceled fight wasn't just a missed opportunity. It was millions in marketing lost, pay-per-view projections disrupted, and divisions left without direction. Holloway wasn't only fighting for legacy, he was fighting under pressures that few champions ever experience. And as scrutiny intensified, so did the stakes. Because behind the controversies lay an even more uncomfortable truth. The business depended on him, perhaps more than the UFC wanted to admit. And that truth brings us to the force that silently shapes every fighter's destiny: money. Long before the public questioned his health or legacy, the UFC already understood a truth they rarely say out loud. Max Holloway was a revenue engine. Not just a contender, not just a champion, he was a guaranteed draw. A fighter who could anchor an event, stabilize a division, and energize global markets from Hawaii to the mainland United States. At the peak of his run, Holloway earned fight purses ranging from $300,000 to over $700,000 per bout, not counting bonuses and undisclosed locker room incentives. But the real power came from something far more valuable than a paycheck: PPV influence. Even when he wasn't headlining, his name could raise projections by tens of thousands of buys. That meant millions of dollars that didn't show up on his personal contract, but absolutely showed up on the UFC's balance sheets. Outside the cage, Holloway's financial footprint only expanded. Sponsorships, appearance deals, merch sales, gaming collaborations, brand partnerships. Each added layers to an income stream that quietly pushed his net worth into the multi-million range. And unlike fighters who built businesses around controversy, Max built his through something much more profitable: loyalty. People trusted him, gravitated toward him, and spent money because he represented something rare in the sport: authenticity. The UFC recognized this immediately. Not every champion creates momentum when they speak. Not every fighter commands attention without theatrics. But Holloway did. His confidence, his humor, his iconic line, "I'm the best boxer in the UFC," became global sound bites, turning him into a brand the UFC could market again and again. And this is where the relationship became more complicated. The more money Holloway generated, the less replaceable he became. Even during losing streaks, even when questions swirled about his long-term health, even when critics debated whether he should move divisions, the UFC never distanced itself from him. Why? Because the economics didn't allow it. A star like Holloway doesn't simply represent wins. He represents predictable revenue, fan loyalty, and stability in a division often plagued by uncertainty. When a fighter reaches that level, they stop being an athlete in the eyes of the organization and become something much more strategic: an asset. And assets are protected. They are pushed. They are kept in the spotlight, even when others might deserve the opportunity more. This protection created its own backlash. Some fans questioned why Holloway continued receiving high-profile matchups, why title shot conversations never fully disappeared, why the UFC seemed unwilling to let the division move on without him. But the answer wasn't emotional, it was financial. As long as Max Holloway remained both elite and bankable, the organization had every incentive to keep him at the top. Yet this advantage carried a hidden cost: Because the more valuable he became, the more pressure settled on his shoulders. Pressure to perform, to stay healthy, to stay relevant, to live up to a market value the UFC itself helped create. All the fame and all the earnings raised one question that no contract could ever answer. How does a man stay grounded when the business around him depends on him staying larger than life? To understand that, we have to leave the arena behind and step into the world Holloway lives in, when the lights fade. Away from the roar of sold-out arenas and the endless highlight reels, Max Holloway lives a life that is far quieter and far more complicated than the world imagines. In Hawaii, he is not just a fighter. He is a symbol of resilience, a reminder that greatness can come from the humblest beginnings. Yet that same symbolism has also become a weight he carries everywhere he goes. Fans see the confidence, the humor, the effortless swagger, but few see the loneliness that often follows a fighter who has spent his entire adult life preparing for the next battle. His days outside the cage are a mix of discipline and introspection. Training remains constant, almost ritualistic, as if his identity depends on it. And in many ways, it does. For more than 10 years, Holloway has lived in a cycle that never truly ends: win, lose, recover, prepare, repeat. Fame gave him opportunities and comfort, but it also took privacy, softness, and rest. Even simple moments with his son became reminders of the sacrifices he had made to stay in the game. And when his fights became more violent, more demanding, critics began asking whether he should slow down. Max, however, has always been caught between two versions of himself: the disciplined athlete who protects his future, and the warrior who fights as if it is the last time he will ever step into the cage. Outside the public eye, Holloway's life reflects a man constantly navigating this internal conflict. His relationships, like his career, have endured turbulence, distance created by travel, emotional exhaustion, and the unspoken pressure of being everything to everyone. Friends describe him as grounded yet burdened, grateful yet stretched thin. He is a man who gives endlessly to the sport but receives little protection from the emotional toll it demands. This tension explains why his lifestyle sometimes appears paradoxical. He lives simply, yet carries the expectations of a global fan base. He speaks calmly, yet absorbs scrutiny that would break most athletes. He projects invincibility, yet privately wrestles with fears about longevity, legacy, and whether the world will remember him for who he was or only for what he did in the cage. And each time he returns home to Hawaii, the contrast becomes unmistakable. The beaches are quiet, the world slows down, but the questions do not. How long can he sustain this pace? How much more can his body take? And at what point does the legend demand too great a price from the man who built it? These uncertainties bleed directly into the chaos of his career, shaping decisions, relationships, and every high-stakes moment that comes next. Yet even with all the pressure, one truth remains. Max Holloway still carries something the UFC cannot afford to lose. And to understand why, we must look at the one force more powerful than fame, talent, or legacy: his irreplaceable value to the organization itself. For all the talk about champions, rankings, and title belts, the UFC's real engine has always been something far more fragile: star power. And Max Holloway possesses a version of it that is almost impossible to manufacture. He doesn't rely on trash talk, scandals, or theatrics. His draw comes from something more rare: a mixture of authenticity, violence, and heart that resonates across every demographic the UFC depends on. That is why losing him has never been an option the organization wants to consider. Holloway's fan base is not just large, it is loyal. From Hawaii to the mainland United States, from Europe to Southeast Asia, his fights consistently generate global attention. Even without a belt, he can anchor a card and lift pay-per-view numbers in a way only a handful of fighters in the world can. When a single athlete can affect projections by hundreds of thousands of buys, the organization does not simply promote him, they protect him. But his value goes deeper than sales. Within the featherweight division, Holloway represents stability in a weight class often plagued by injuries, inconsistency, and champions whose reigns don't last. He is the one constant, the measuring stick that determines whether contenders are great or merely good. Without Max Holloway, the division loses its narrative, its history, and its connection to a decade of unforgettable wars. The UFC knows this better than anyone. That is why, even after losses to Alexander Volkanovski, they continued offering him high-profile matchups. Why title shot conversations never disappeared. Why Holloway was pushed into marquee events instead of being quietly shuffled aside. Because the sport needs fighters who guarantee excitement, who deliver violence without recklessness, who showcase technique without losing the raw chaos fans crave. And no one blends those elements better than Holloway. His fights are not merely competitions, they are spectacles. The kind audiences rewatch for years, the kind broadcasters promote endlessly, the kind that make a card feel complete. Behind closed doors, the UFC understands a truth few fans ever consider. Max Holloway elevates everyone around him. When he fights, the entire roster benefits from increased viewership. When he headlines, the entire event gains legitimacy. And when he wins, the UFC's long-term plans for its divisions become instantly clearer. That influence creates an uncomfortable question for the organization. Is Max Holloway being protected because he is essential to the UFC's future, or because the UFC cannot afford a world where he no longer exists as its backbone? Either answer reveals the same truth. He is far more than a fighter. He is infrastructure, a pillar, a rare asset whose departure would echo through the sport for years. And it is this fear of losing him financially, strategically, and emotionally that shapes how the UFC treats him today. Yet even with all this power, the final chapter of his legacy is still unwritten. And to understand what that chapter might become, we must confront the one question that has followed him since the beginning. When the story of Max Holloway is finally told, it will never fit neatly into a single category. He was too skilled to be underestimated, too human to be invincible, and too important to ever be ignored. His career became a fusion of brilliance and brutality, triumph and vulnerability, an ongoing reminder that greatness in combat sports is rarely a straight line. For every highlight that defined the Blessed Era, there were shadows he carried alone. The weight cuts, the pressure, the expectations of an entire state, and the silent wars fought far from the cameras. Yet he remained standing, not because he avoided hardship, but because he confronted it with a calmness that made the world believe he could endure anything. The true measure of his legacy may not lie in titles or statistics, but in the way he made fans feel each time he stepped into the cage, the way he turned violence into art, the way he made doubt impossible, even in defeat. Still, one question lingers, one that neither the UFC nor the fans can fully answer. Who controls the future of Max Holloway? The organization that relies on him, the audience that adores him, or the man himself, choosing his own path after years of sacrifice? His story is not finished. It bends, shifts, and rewrites itself with every fight, every victory, every moment of resilience. And whether he rises again or walks away on his own terms, one truth remains. Max Holloway has already changed the sport in ways no one can undo.